pierced. Dostoevsky. were in Gerst. It was a gloomy, stormy day. Although he wore his overcoat, he still felt cold, too. My question about him he answered by saying, "In me is the chill of the grave." He said this quite slowly and with an emphatic stress. Gerber goes on with his story by saying, "We took street car to his lodgings, which were in Gersthof. It was a gloomy, stormy day. Although he wore his overcoat, he still felt cold, too." My aunt's question of him he answered by saying, "In me is the chill of the grave." He says quite slowly and with an emphatic stress that every word cut to my heart. It was quite clear to me he could not be left alone while in that condition. When we reached his room, he said, "There's already a smell of corpse here, isn't there?" The room gave the impression of not having had fresh air for several days. I asked him to come and spend the evening with me. It was under those circumstances that I told him the news that I had seen the morning paper, which later proved to be false, that Nut, Hanson, to whom he felt much attached, whose book he owned, whose pen he had called the greatest book in the world, had shot himself. Otto winced, looked disturbed, and said he, too, then he was even more somehow refused to leave the room and go with me, and his conversation consisted only of hints which he perhaps not and
but those hints left no doubt as to his condition. It was getting dark. When I asked him to turn on the light, he groaned as if he were being choked by an intolerable pain. "No, no light," and then he repeated it, stressing each syllable, so that it was not hard to
guess his thoughts. No light. In that painful hour, when it was a question of saving or losing my most precious friend, it was clear to me that only one thing would be of any help: unflinching energy. Instinctively, I asked him, "Do you have a weapon here?" He was silent. I repeated the question. No answer. Then I pleaded with him and begged him to give me his weapon.
Hello, my name is Allison. I am an American English voice. We had never spoken an angry word to each other, but now, when I was trembling with sorrow and anxiety, now for the first time in his life he shouted at me as if I were his enemy. "One, you have no right to take away from me my own will." He had jumped up. We had never spoken an angry word to each other, but now, when I was trembling with sorrow and anxiety, now for the first time in his life he shouted at me as if I were his enemy. "One, you have no right to take away from me my own will." He had jumped up and stood directly in front of me. Painful as the moment was for both of us, it was necessary for me to remain uncompromisingly firm in order not to lose everything. I threatened him and said that I would search for the weapon myself if he did not give it to me willingly. Then he answered, a little subdued, "I have no weapon." Shortly afterward he said that he was ready to go with me and to spend the night with me. When we arrived there it was nearly 8 o'clock. He complained of the cold and sat down by the stove. When supper was served, he refused to eat a bite. All urging that he eat something was in vain. Although the windows were closed and the stove so hot that the heat in the room was intolerable, he kept his overcoat on, put more coal on the fire constantly, and moved closer to it. Finally, after several hours, I succeeded in making him eat a little. We were now seated facing each other. His expression seemed a bit easier. For a short while it seemed as if everything was as it used to be, as if the future were full of hope for both of us. But when a little time had passed his face once more became painfully serious. The crisis was not yet over. To be able to meet the danger, I had to discover what had brought him into this mood. He confessed that he wanted to kill himself, but he refused to give any reason. In the hours that followed there was between us a struggle of wills and energies. "From me, I must know. You must tell me. I cannot lose you this way." And from him always the same sullen answer, "I cannot tell you, not even you, what we suffered through that night, which I can remember only with horror. Horror is something I am incapable of describing." Finally, long past midnight, he gave in. He rose very solemnly and said with a voice as sinister, as icy cold, as desperate, and without hope as I have ever heard from a human being, "I know that I am a born criminal. I am a born murderer." My first thought was that this noble, rich, and pure mind was overturned, that he, who could not pass a worm or an insect on the road without stopping to take it to safety, this good, this sacred man, was harboring such sinister ideas in his soul. He must be mad. He must have gone insane. That was the only possibility. Once he began, it was easier for him to talk. I spent a night in a hotel room in Munich once. I could not sleep. Then I heard a barking dog. I have never heard a dog bark in such a terrifying way. It must have been a black dog. It was the evil spirit, capital I. Fought with it. I fought with it for my soul. In sheer terror I bit the sheets to shreds that night. Since that time I have known that I am a murderer. That is why I must kill myself. Otto Weininger, the good, the noble Weininger, speak. In such words, I don't know how I answered him. I only know that I talked to him for a long time, that I defended the murderer that night, and defended him with sincerity because I did not believe in his guilt. I do know that I begged and pleaded for his life, and that I always heard the same reply: you cannot persuade me, you cannot force me, let me alone, it must be, I cannot go on living. Taschenbuch, pages 18-20. Though the struggle went on, it is clear that Weininger's emotions had reached a climax. Gerber's earlier description of Otto's actions, his speech with its strange, remote stresses, his closed, introvert attitude, his ice-cold words, "In me is the chill of the grave," shows that Weininger was in a psychotic condition. The macabre incident, ending after midnight with Otto avowing that he was a born criminal, a born murderer, demonstrated the extent of his self-accusation and self-reproach. Such self-abasement is a common SJR and Tochnov mental disturbance. It had deep roots in Weininger. The conflicting Torsiris mind were steadily more accentuated on that night until with the declaration that he was a born criminal, a born murderer, his guilt feelings reached a peak of intensity. Gerber ends his story: when I asked if his intention had been directed against any definite person, he gave no clear answer. It was soon dawn. The lamp had gone out. I felt exhausted and discouraged because my efforts had been unsuccessful. Capital I had spent all my energy. His will had been the stronger. In my great fear of losing my friend and with a vague feel in that I was leaving him forever, I said a few words with my last, decisive strength. I wept, and my sentiment had effect. Where my words had availed nothing, he put his hand on my forehead, and there were tears in his eyes. In an extremely solemn tone he said, "I thank you." He would go on living, but I must be silent. He needed peace and must be left alone. It was full daylight when he left me. We never mentioned this night to each other again. Taschenbuch, pages 20-21. Such is Gerber's story of one of the crucial passages in the life of Otto Weininger. We must then ask, how accurate is the account? An answer cannot be given readily. It has not been possible to find out whether or not Gerber noted down the events in his diary at the time. If he did record Weininger's words soon after they were spoken on the November night of 1902, we might accept them without question. Yet Gerber's book was not published until 1919, 16 years after Weininger's death and 17 years after the episode mentioned here. The fact that Gerber and Duvall deciphered Weininger's stenographic notes after his death may possibly have affected the account. There is some doubt as to whether Gerber could have remembered the conversation with Weininger in completely accurate detail. On the other hand, we cannot assume that his description of that exciting occurrence was pure imagination. One bit of evidence supports the theory that he wrote down his memoirs of Weininger shortly after Otto's death. Gerber wrote to Strindberg, and Strindberg sent him 2 letters, dated October 22 and December 8, 1903, in memory of Weininger. It would seem a natural inference that Gerber at that time wanted to write a book about Otto shortly after his death, but, for one reason or another, did not complete the task. At that time Gerber might well have been prompted to write his recollections of Weininger because he found that the criticism aimed at Weininger's book and the picture given of his personality by other writers were unjust. We have also a description of Weininger's suicide plan. Historic truth ought to be no less sacred than religion. If the precepts of faith raise our soul above the interests of this world, the lessons of history, in their turn, inspire us with the love of the beautiful and the just, and the hatred of whatever presents an obstacle to the progress of humanity. These lessons, to be profitable, require certain conditions. It is necessary that the facts be produced with a rigorous exactness, that the changes political or social be analyzed philosophically, that the exciting interest of the details of the lives of public men should not divert attention from the political part they played, or cause us to forget their providential mission. Too often the writer represents the different phases of history as spontaneous events, without seeking in preceding facts their true origin, and their natural deduction, like the painter who, in reproducing the characteristics of nature, only seizes their picturesque effect, without being able, in his picture, to give their scientific demonstration. The historian ought to be more than a painter. He ought, like the geologist, who explains the phenomena of the globe, to unfold the secret of the transformation of societies. But, in writing history, by what means are we to arrive at truth? By following the rules of logic. Let us first take for granted that a great effect is always due to a great cause, never to a small one. In other words, an accident, insignificant in appearance, never leads to important results without a pre-existing cause, which has permitted this slight accident to produce a great effect. The spark only lights up a vast conflagration when it falls upon combustible matters previously collected. Montesquieu thus confirms this idea. It is not fortune, he says, which rules the world. There are general causes, whether moral or physical, which act in every monarchy, raising, maintaining, or overthrowing it. All accidents are subject to these causes, and if the fortune of a battle, that is to say, a particular cause, has ruined a state, there was a general cause which made it necessary that that state should perish through a single battle. In a word, the principal cause drags with it all the particular accidents. 1. If during nearly 1,000 years the Romans always came triumphant out of the severest trials and greatest perils, it is because there existed a general cause which made them always superior to their enemies, and which did not permit partial defeats and misfortunes to entail the fall of the empire. If the Romans, after giving an example to the world of a people constituting itself and growing great by liberty, seemed, after Caesar, to throw themselves blindly into slavery, it is because there existed a general reason which by fatality prevented the Republic from returning to the purity of its ancient institutions. It is because the new wants and interests of a society and labor required other means to satisfy them, just as logic demonstrates that the reason of important events is imperious. In like manner we must recognize in the long duration of an institution the proof of its goodness, and in the incontestable influence of a man upon his age the proof of his genius. The task, then, consists in seeking the vital element which constituted the strength of the institution, as the predominant idea which caused man to act. In following this rule, we shall avoid the errors of those historians who gather facts transmitted by preceding ages, without properly arranging them according to their philosophical importance, thus glorifying that which merits blame, and leaving in the shade that which calls for the light. It is not a minute analysis of the Roman organization which will enable us to understand the duration of so great an empire, but the profound examination of the spirit of its institutions. No more is it the detailed recital of the most trivial actions of a superior man which will reveal the secret of his ascendancy, but the attentive investigation of the elevated motives of his conduct. When extraordinary facts attest an eminent genius, what is more contrary to good sense than to ascribe to him all the passions and sentiments of mediocrity? What more erroneous than not to recognize the preeminence of those privileged beings who appear in history from time to time like luminous beacons, dissipating the darkness of their epoch, and throwing light into the future? To deny this preeminence would, indeed, be to insult humanity, by believing it capable of submitting, long and voluntarily, to a domination which did not rest on true greatness and incontestable utility. Let us be logical, and we shall be just. Too many historians find it easier to lower men of genius, than, with a generous inspiration, to raise them to their due height, by penetrating their vast designs. Thus, as regards Caesar, instead of showing us Rome, torn to pieces by civil wars and corrupted by riches, trampling under foot her ancient institutions, threatened by powerful peoples, such as Gauls, Germans, and Parthians, incapable of sustaining herself without a central power stronger, more stable, and more just, instead, I say, of tracing this faithful picture, Caesar is represented, from an early age, as already aspiring to the supreme power. If he opposes Sylla, if he disagrees with Cicero, if he allies himself with Pompey, it is the result of that far-sighted astuteness which divined everything with a view to bring everything under subjection. If he throws himself into Gaul, it is to acquire riches by pillage. 2 are soldiers devoted to his projects. If he crosses the sea to carry the Roman eagles into an unknown country, but the conquest of which will strengthen that of Gaul. 3. It is to seek their pearls which were believed to exist in the seas of Great Britain. 4. If, after having vanquished the formidable enemies of Italy on the other side of the Alps, he meditates an expedition against the Parthians, to avenge the defeat of Crassus, it is, as certain historians say, because activity was a part of his nature, and that his health was better when he was campaigning. 5. If he accepts from the Senate with thankfulness a crown of laurel, and wears it with pride, it is to conceal his bald head. If, lastly, he is assassinated by those whom he had loaded with benefits, it is because he sought to make himself king, as though he were to his contemporaries, as well as for posterity, the greatest of all kings, since Suetonius and Plutarch. Such are the paltry interpretations which it has pleased people to give to the noblest actions. But by what sign are we to recognize a man's greatness? By the empire of his ideas, when his principles and his system triumph in spite of his death or defeaturing, is it not, in fact, the peculiarity of genius to survive destruction, and to extend its empire over future generations? Caesar disappeared, and his influence predominates still more than during his life. Cicero, his adversary, is compelled to exclaim, all the acts of Caesar, his writings, his words, his promises, his thoughts, have more force since his death than if he were still alive. 6. For ages it was enough to tell the world that such was the will of Caesar, for the world to obey it. The preceding remarks sufficiently explain the aim I have in view in writing this history. This aim is to prove that, when Providence raises up such men as Caesar, Charlemagne, and Napoleon, it is to trace out to peoples the path they ought to follow, to stamp with the seal of their genius a new era, and to accomplish in a few years the labor of many centuries. Happy the peoples who comprehend and follow them. Woe to those who misunderstand and combat them. They, as the Jews did, they crucify their Messiah. They are blind and culpable, blind, for they do not see the impotence of their efforts to suspend the definitive triumph of good, culpable, for they only retard progress by impeding its prompt and fruitful application. In fact, neither the murder of Caesar, nor the captivity of St. Helena, have been able to destroy irrevocably 2 popular causes overthrown by a league which disguised itself under the mask of liberty. Brutus, by slaying Caesar, plunged Rome into the horrors of civil war. He did not prevent the reign of Augustus, but he rendered possible those of Nero and Caligula. The ostracism of Napoleon by confederated Europe has been no more successful in preventing the empire from being resuscitated, and, nevertheless, how far are we from the great question solved, the passions calmed, and the legitimate satisfactions given to peoples by the First Empire? Thus every day since 1815 has verified the prophecy of the captive of St. Helena. How many struggles, how much blood, how many years will it not require to realize the good which I intended to do for mankind? 7. Palace of the Tuileries, March 20, 1862.